My parents forgot my birthday again this year. No call. No message. But 3 weeks later, they hosted a lavish party for my sister. Lights, speeches, photos everywhere. So this time, I didn't remind them. I made one quiet decision instead, and everything changed. My name is Amelia Hartwell, and this year, like so many before it, my birthday arrived quietly. No notification lit up my phone that morning. No familiar ringtone. No message from my parents asking what time they should call or where we might go to dinner. The silence wasn't dramatic. It was practiced. Polished by repetition, I stood in my kitchen with a mug of coffee cooling between my hands, watching the minutes pass as if they might correct themselves. They didn't. By noon, the absence felt official. By evening, it felt familiar. Growing up, I learned that forgetting could hurt more than saying the wrong thing. When my parents forgot my birthday, there was never an apology later. There was always an explanation. They were busy. Something came up. We'll celebrate another time. Another time rarely came. What made it harder was that forgetting wasn't the family standard, it was the version reserved for me. My younger sister, Sophie, never experienced birthdays like this. Hers were events. Themes. Guest lists. Photos that ended up framed, posted, remembered. My parents hosted those parties with pride, introducing her to friends and relatives like proof of something they had done right. I used to tell myself it didn't matter. That adulthood meant lowering expectations. That birthdays were childish things to outgrow. But standing alone in my apartment that night, I realized how carefully I'd been managing my own disappointment to keep the peace. This wasn't about cake or gifts or attention. It was about the quiet understanding that had shaped my life, that I would always be the one who adjusted, waited, and understood while someone else was celebrated. That night, I didn't remind my parents. I didn't joke about it. I didn't send a message fishing for acknowledgement. For the first time, I let the day pass exactly as it was. This wasn't the first birthday they forgot. It was the first time I stopped pretending it didn't matter. Growing up, I didn't think of my childhood as unhappy. That was the strange part. There were meals on the table, rides to school, parents who showed up when it mattered, just not always for me. I was the easy one. That was the word my parents liked to use when people asked about us. Amelia is so independent. Amelia never complains. Amelia understands. It sounded like praise, and for a long time I wore it like a badge. Sophie, my younger sister, was different. She was sensitive, expressive. She needed reassurance, encouragement, celebration. When she cried, the house shifted to accommodate her feelings. When I went quiet, it was taken as proof that I was fine. If Sophie wanted something, it became a family discussion. If I needed something, it became a lesson in patience. I learned early how to shrink my wants into something manageable. I stopped asking for help unless it felt urgent enough to justify the inconvenience. I learned to say it's okay before anyone asked if it was. Over time, that answer became automatic. My parents never framed it as favoritism. They framed it as balance. Sophie needed more, so she received more. I needed less, so I was given less. It sounded logical when they explained it. It even sounded fair. What no one noticed was how that logic shaped me. I became careful, reliable, self-contained. I learned to anticipate disappointment so it wouldn't surprise me later. I learned to celebrate my own achievements quietly, sometimes alone, because making a fuss felt inappropriate, almost embarrassing. There were moments when I sensed the difference clearly. The way conversations lit up when Sophie entered a room, the way my accomplishments were acknowledged with a nod before the topic shifted back to her. Nothing cruel. Nothing obvious. Just consistent. By the time I was an adult, the pattern felt so familiar that I stopped questioning it. This was just how our family worked. Someone shone. Someone made space for that light. And without ever being asked, I learned exactly which role was mine. As we grew older, the difference between Sophie's milestones and mine became harder to ignore, not because it grew louder, but because it became public. Sophie's birthdays were never just birthdays. They were planned months in advance, with themes chosen carefully and guest lists revised again and again. My parents debated venues, menus, and seating as if each detail mattered deeply. Photos were taken from every angle. Speeches were made. Her name was spoken often and proudly. I stood nearby at those parties, helping where I could. Refilling drinks. Collecting plates. Smiling when relatives told Sophie how lucky she was to have such attentive parents. I smiled because that was expected. I smiled because pointing out the imbalance would have made things uncomfortable, and discomfort was something I had been trained to avoid. When I graduated, there was a small dinner squeezed between my father's work commitments. No invitations. No speeches. My parents told me they were proud, and I believed them, but the moment passed quickly, as if it were something that needed to be acknowledged, then set aside. Sophie's graduation, years later, was a weekend event. Out-of-town guests. Reservations. A toast about her future and the family name she carried forward. My parents spoke about her achievements as investments, proof of what they had nurtured. I noticed how easily pride came when it could be shared. When it reflected well on them, the contrast wasn't about money. It was about energy. Attention. The way my sister's accomplishments were treated as moments worth amplifying, while mine were folded neatly into the background. Over time, I stopped expecting the same level of celebration. I told myself recognition wasn't why I worked hard. That validation should come from within. Those ideas helped me survive the imbalance, but they didn't erase it. Watching Sophie be celebrated taught me something important. Even then, in our family, visibility was a form of value. And I had learned to live without it. By the time this year's birthday approached, I told myself not to expect anything different. I had learned that expectations were where disappointment hid. Still, some small part of me waited, quiet but hopeful, as if habit alone might eventually teach them to remember. The day arrived without ceremony. No call in the morning. No text wrapped in casual apology. I went to work, answered emails, moved through meetings as if the date carried no meaning at all. It was strange how invisible something could feel while still pressing against you from the inside. Around lunchtime, I checked my phone without thinking. Nothing. I imagined my parents' calendar filled with Sophie's upcoming plans, her next celebration already taking shape. I wondered if my birthday had ever truly lived there, or if it had always existed somewhere off to the side, easy to overlook. What struck me wasn't anger. It was the absence of surprise. There was no crisis that had pulled their attention away. No emergency. Just a normal day, unfolding exactly as it always had, and that was the moment something shifted for me. I realized they hadn't forgotten because life was busy, they had forgotten because remembering me had never been urgent. That understanding landed quietly. It didn't demand action or confrontation. It simply settled into place, heavy and undeniable. That evening, I lit a candle on my kitchen counter and let it burn while I ate dinner alone. I didn't post about it. I didn't mention it to friends. I didn't remind my parents, the way I sometimes had in the past, half joking, giving them a chance to recover. This time, I didn't reach out. For the first time, I let the day stand as proof not of neglect, but of a choice that had been made long before this year ever arrived. The decision didn't come in a rush of emotion. There was no dramatic breaking point, no sleepless night filled with anger. It came quietly, in the days after my birthday, when the silence had settled and nothing rushed in to replace it. For years, I had been careful with money in a way my parents never noticed. I worked late, passed on vacations, said no to things that felt unnecessary. Not because I was frugal by nature, but because I wanted something that belonged entirely to me. A life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or generosity. When I found the place, it didn't look impressive on paper. A small home, simple and modest, tucked into a neighborhood that felt calm rather than exciting. But the moment I stood inside, I felt something unfamiliar. Certainty. No one else's voice was in my head, weighing the pros and cons, questioning whether it was practical or appropriate. I signed the papers without telling my parents, without asking if it made sense, without wondering how it might affect family plans or expectations. For the first time, I made a major decision that didn't include them at all. On moving day, I carried boxes in and out of my car alone. Each trip felt strangely ceremonial, like I was crossing an invisible line with every step. That evening, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, surrounded by unpacked boxes, and let the quiet exist without trying to fill it. I took a single photo from the window, nothing staged, nothing celebratory. Just proof that the space was real. I posted it online with a short caption, "Birthday gift. From me." I didn't tag my parents. I didn't send it to Sophie. I didn't explain. I set my phone face down on the floor and went back to unpacking, unaware of how loud the silence was about to become. I didn't hear my phone at first. It was buried under a folded sweater on the floor, buzzing softly like something alive. When I finally picked it up, the screen was crowded with missed calls and notifications stacked on top of one another. The photo had traveled faster than I expected. The family group chat was already active, messages piling up in quick succession. Screenshots of my posts sat in the thread, circled and commented on as if they were evidence of something I had done wrong. No one asked if I liked the place. No one asked how I felt. The questions were sharper than that. How did you afford this? Why would you do something like this without telling us? Do you know what people will think? My parents' messages carried a tone I recognized immediately, concern shaped carefully to sound reasonable. They worried aloud about timing, about appearances, about whether I was being impulsive. They mentioned Sophie's upcoming celebration, the plans already in motion, the expectations that had been set. It didn't take long to understand what had really been disrupted. This wasn't about my well-being. It was about control. About a decision that had been made without their input, at a moment when they had assumed my resources, financial and emotional, were already spoken for. When my mother finally called, I let it ring twice before answering. She didn't ask how the move had gone. She didn't ask why I hadn't said anything. She went straight to how blindsided they felt, how this should have been discussed as a family. My father followed with a message about responsibility and unity, about how families didn't make choices in isolation. I listened, quiet and still, noticing how calm I felt compared to how they sounded. For the first time, I wasn't scrambling to soothe the situation or translate my choices into something more acceptable. Their reaction had confirmed what the silence on my birthday already had. I hadn't broken a rule. I had stepped outside of one. The money entered the conversation the way it always had, indirectly. No one asked me outright to contribute. Instead, the expectation drifted toward me through careful comments and half-finished sentences. My parents mentioned rising costs, how much things had changed, how expensive it was to host an event properly. Sophie's upcoming celebration came up often, framed as something important for the family, something that needed to be done right. I listened, recognizing the pattern. For years, my savings had been treated as flexible, available, a quiet backup plan no one needed to name because it was assumed I would step in when things tightened. This time, I didn't. When my mother finally suggested softly, almost apologetically, that I might help cover part of the expense, the number she mentioned made my chest tighten. It wasn't a small contribution. It was the kind of sum that erased security and replaced it with obligation. I didn't argue. I didn't explain my budget or list the reasons it wasn't fair. I didn't remind them of how often I had helped before. I simply said, no. The word felt unfamiliar in my mouth, steady and unadorned. There was a pause on the line that stretched longer than any argument ever had. No one rushed to fill it. My parents sounded surprised, not angry, not hurt. Disoriented, as if I had declined something that was already settled. My father asked if I was sure. My mother said she understood, but her voice carried disappointment like an accusation. I didn't soften it. I didn't offer a compromise. I repeated myself once calmly and let the silence return. After the call ended, I sat alone in my new living room, waiting for the familiar guilt to arrive. It didn't. For the first time, saying no hadn't cost me peace. It had protected it. The consequences didn't arrive with raised voices or dramatic confrontations. They arrived the way truth often does, slowly, in small adjustments no one announced out loud. Sophie's celebration still went on. Photos appeared online, carefully framed to suggest abundance and ease. But even from a distance, I could see the differences. Fewer guests. A simpler setting. Subtle changes that meant plans had been reshaped to fit reality rather than expectation. No one mentioned my absence directly. Instead, questions drifted back to me through relatives who didn't quite know which version of the story to believe. They asked how I was settling in, whether I liked my new place. Their curiosity felt cautious, almost tentative, as if they were testing the ground. I answered the same way each time. Calmly. Factually. I said I had moved. I said I was doing well. I didn't explain my parents' reactions or defend their intentions. I didn't correct the narrative for them anymore. That distance mattered more than I expected. Without my quiet participation, my parents' version of events had to stand on its own. And without someone smoothing the edges, small inconsistencies became harder to ignore. People noticed that concern sounded a lot like control. That worry seemed to follow money more closely than feelings. Meanwhile, my own life grew almost boring in the best way. I unpacked the last of the boxes. I learned which grocery store had the shortest lines, which neighbors waved back. My work stayed steady. My finances remained untouched by anyone else's expectations. The space I had created around myself wasn't empty. It was protective. I didn't block my parents or make any formal declarations. I simply stopped filling the gaps between what they said and what was true. I stopped absorbing discomfort that wasn't mine to carry. Real distance, I learned, doesn't always look like disappearance. Sometimes, it looks like standing still and letting other people realize you're no longer where they left you. For a long time, I thought change had to be loud to count. That it needed confrontation, explanations, or some final, undeniable moment where everything was said out loud. This time taught me otherwise. This time didn't mean I finally made my parents understand. It didn't mean they apologized or suddenly saw the years of imbalance for what they were. It meant I stopped waiting for that to happen. I didn't cut them off in anger. I didn't punish anyone. I simply stepped out of a role that had required me to shrink myself so others could feel comfortable. I chose not to remind, not to smooth, not to fund, not to explain. This time, I treated my own boundaries as real, even when they were inconvenient. I learned that family love does not give anyone unlimited access to your time, money, or silence. And distance doesn't always come from rejection, it can come from self-respect. If there's one thing I hope someone else takes from this, it's this. You don't have to make a scene to make a change. Sometimes the most powerful moment is the quiet one, when you decide to live differently and let the truth follow on its own. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've been expected to understand, to give, to stay quiet so others could shine, I want you to know this: you're not wrong for wanting more respect. You don't owe anyone unlimited access to your time, your money, or your silence just because they share your last name. If my story resonated with you, please leave a comment and tell me what part hit you the hardest or what you would have done in my place. Your words might help someone else feel less alone. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about self-respect, boundaries, and quiet strength, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps these voices be heard.